is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. When deciding on a college or university, students and families often turn to popular rankings to help inform their decisions. The Washington Monthly magazine offers its own formula for evaluating post-secondary institutions, and it includes factors like how likely graduates are to earn high-paying jobs in their chosen fields, and whether they participate in public service or voting. Joining us today to discuss it is Paul Glastris. He's the editor-in-chief. We're going to discuss the rankings and how education journalists can make smarter use of the available data for their own reporting. Paul, welcome back to EWA Radio.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start at the top. This is the 15th year of the Washington Monthly's college rankings. What was the motivation all those years ago to get into this?
Well, I had spent a decade at U.S. News and World Report, and though I didn't work on their college ranking, knew just from scuttlebutt that the rankings themselves were a little hinky. And in the early 2000s, we published some major pieces criticizing the rankings and really learned a lot about how rankings are done, what they measure and don't. We believed that the idea of ranking colleges was a good one. We just thought U.S. News metrics were not only not helpful, actually detrimental, and decided, if we're so smart, can we come up with rankings that we think would be good for society? And so that's what we did. We basically said, if you're a citizen, if you're a taxpayer, what is it you want for the $150 billion a year that the federal government pours into higher education financing? And we came up with three things. We said, well, what we want out of our universities is, number one, for students to get a shot at the middle class, to move up in society. Number two, we want the universities to produce the scholars and scholarship that drive economic growth and can fix the great problems we have, like climate change. And number three, we want schools to encourage students to be active, good citizens. And so we came up with these alternative methods, and we've been doing it ever since.
There is some overlap. For example, you might find some schools that score high on U.S. News and World Report's rankings and other places that also overlap with yours, but you also have some schools a lot of people may have never heard of. And I'm wondering, what were some of the surprise performers this year among the public universities?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest surprise for most people, not to us, is whereas the U.S. News top 20, 19 of the schools are elite private universities. In the Washington Monthly top 20, 11 of the 20 are public universities. Some of them you wouldn't be surprised, University of California, Berkeley. Others you might kind of wonder about. UC Davis. A real surprise is Utah State University. I think it's number 256 on the U.S. News ranking, but it's in our top 20 and has been for several years and has been rising in those rankings.
I think it's fascinating because we do spend a lot of time talking about these elite schools and the relatively small percentage of students who attend them. It's something like 3 to 5% of the nation's college students go to these elite schools, and we don't pay enough attention to where the vast majority of these students are going. Would you say your list is maybe a little bit more egalitarian?
I think so. We spend very little time focused on the elite schools for the very reasons you say. In fact, we don't even rank schools best based on SAT scores, which is the U.S. News system, right? U.S. News just has a very different set of rankings. They're looking at whether schools have money, whether they're exclusive, and whether they have prestige. And by those categories, right, things like SAT scores and spending per student, spending on faculty, percentage of alumni who give, things like that, or the survey that they do to find out what college presidents think of other colleges. Those things are guaranteed to put all the focus or the bulk of the focus to define good around elite universities, ones that are able to extract a lot of tuition and have wealthy people pay for it and therefore spend a lot of money, and that sort of exclude as many students as possible. Ours are the opposite. We're rewarding schools that recruit and graduate students of modest means, poor students. We're giving schools a lot of benefit for graduating students of modest means. And we're looking at these other areas like whether students vote, whether they serve in the military, whether they serve in the Peace Corps. And so US News rankings are good rankings if you're an affluent parent looking to get your kid into a fancy school. Ours are good rankings if you're a person of modest means trying to get the best school you can, or a taxpayer trying to determine whether the higher education system is working or your alma mater is living up to its civic responsibility.
Well, I was thinking about this, and I think from a philosophical standpoint, the way your rankings stand apart to me is a lot of other rankings are, will this school be good for you, the individual? Whereas your rankings are, is this school contributing to communities and also is it good for society as a whole? And I think that sort of targets the question that comes up constantly, which is college worth it?
Yeah, I mean, you've just put your finger on it. That's why we created these rankings. And, you know, US News purports to have defined, or these other rankings purport to have defined what a good college is. We don't even measure, there's no measure of learning, right? It for colleges. You could go through and have 4 years and you get the degree, but we have no idea if that what that person learned. Absent that, you have to kind of come up with second order, third order measures to measure excellence. And so we just think that it's folly to say the education you're getting at this school is outstanding and this one terrible when we don't have those kind of outcome measures, other than we do have earnings, which are something. Instead, we ask a different question. Are these schools doing right by the citizen, by the taxpayer, by the community? And there's an advantage for an individual looking at this. There are some measures that do enhance a student or a family's capacity to choose the right school for them. But you're right, mostly this is an exercise in determining what schools are doing for the country.
There are three areas I want to pull out and discuss from these rankings that are unique to the Washington Monthly. And first up, you looked at schools that are doing well in terms of graduating Black students into well-paying jobs, albeit on a much smaller scale than anybody would like. And I thought there was a lot of food for thought here, including taking a close look at schools that are doing a good job with majors that Black students are already choosing, like sociology, criminal justice, and recognizing that's a very personal choice. That is, not just focusing on programs that are trying to bring students of color into underrepresented majors like STEM, although that's also a worthwhile goal. Let's take that apart a little bit.
So yeah, you've done a good job of defining what we try to do. On the one hand, we took a good look at what is keeping Black students who have all of the requisite test scores and training and background and desire to achieve in STEM. Why are they dropping out, not choosing it at levels that you would expect from students who are Black, who are undergrad, but also dropping out and not pursuing it? So we asked the question, what might be done to encourage more African American students to choose and stay with STEM? And what we found is a group of Black academics who have been scratching their heads about this and doing research about it for a number of years. And what they found is for a lot of Black students, having a major and a career that has an element of social justice to it, has an element of doing good for the world, is extremely important. And what they find is that in STEM education, the current programs and professors simply aren't doing much of anything to say to Black students, hey, you can use your STEM education to improve life for low-income minorities. You can use it to fight against environmental problems. You can use it for all kinds of ways that you can be proud and be motivated to do that aren't just making, a bridge or a new kind of plastic. And when you do that, more African Americans choose and stick with STEM. So that's one part of it. But then we looked at the majors that African American students actually choose disproportionately. And again, they have an element to them of public service. sociology, criminal justice, social work. Those tend to be not terribly high paying fields. And we know also that blacks get paid less in the same fields as whites. So we tried to figure out which schools had these majors, graduated a lot of black students in these majors, and had average earnings, at least in the first year, were disproportionately high. And we were able to find a few. That's the good news. The bad news is we didn't find many. There just aren't a lot of schools graduating blacks in these majors that lead to significantly good salaries.
And I think that's a frustration for folks is that we know there are these pockets of excellence. And then the question is, how do you scale them up?
Right, right. And again, part of that is that we don't pay people in criminal justice or people who do social work very much money. That's a kind of a broader societal problem. We should, but we don't. But we thought it would at least be a start of a conversation because we were able to do this exercise because we have new data from the Department of Education that I guess we were the first to use on this question, looking at earnings in the first year after graduation for specific programs. And so I think there's more to be done in this.
Well, let's talk about some of the bucks and specifically the bang for the buck, which is another category you're looking at. What does the Washington Monthly consider a good return on investment here?
So our bang for the buck rankings basically are looking at which schools provide reasonably priced tuition and degrees for students who come from the middle to lower half of the income spectrum, whose families, and that provide degrees that mean something in the market, that allow you to earn a decent salary. It's really just the 1/3 of the component of our main rankings. And we've been doing this for 9 years or so. We think it's very important. This is where we think our rankings are a huge consumer benefit, a huge benefit to average students. And, a lot of surprising results. Some of the elite schools do well. By the way, we break this down by region, not nationally. Some of the elite schools do well, but so do places like City University of New York and other places that aren't associated with, elite education.
So, with making it clear that we're not getting an endorsement from this particular college, but I've got a young friend who just graduated in May from Bentley College in Boston, and she had a phenomenal experience. She's an actuary. She wanted to study that. They had a great program. She's graduated, and her starting salary is somewhere around $70,000, which sort of blew my mind.
Yeah, and they do extraordinarily well on our best bang for the buck for the Northeast, is my recollection.
The third area I wanted to talk about is the idea about giving back to the community and in the sense of voting, is voting being a civic responsibility. What did you find about schools that are doing a good job on cultivating youth voters and supporting them?
So the problem with measuring voting at the college level is we don't have the numbers where we can say these colleges' students voted at this rate, because to do that requires the colleges to share their database of students. So the best we can do is look at how they participate in various programs that encourage student voting. And what we found is that if a college is of a mind to increase its student voting rate, it can do so dramatically and quite quickly. I'll give you an example. Northwestern University, I'm making these numbers up, but they're in general correct. Maybe about a third of their freshmen were registered to vote a few years ago. A particular, I think, engineering professor figured out a way whereby when the students come to campus that first day as freshmen in the fall, and they go through a process, that there would be right there a chance for them to register to vote. Not a requirement, but they would have to click through and opt out of registering, and all the tools that were needed for that student if they were registering in, say, their hometown in Utah rather than in Evanston, Illinois. And their registration rate went up from about a third to something like 75, 80%. And they've gone up since then. So there's lots that schools can do, and more of them are doing those things.
We're talking with Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly, about the magazine's college rankings. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. I want to mention there are a lot of great stories in this month's issue building off of the rankings, including by contributing editors like Kevin Carey, Seton Hall professor Robert Kelchin, and education writers like Ann Kim and Jamal Abdul Aleem. Ann Kim is a current EWA reporting fellow, and Jamal is a past EWA reporting fellow. Paul, the Washington Monthly relies in part on data that's collected at the federal level. And I'm wondering, have there been some improvements lately in what you've been able to glean that's on offering from the U.S. Department of Education?
Yes and no. A few years ago, the federal government put out what they call the college scorecard, which included data we've been crying for and demanding in our magazine for years, and that is earnings after college for institutions. So over recent years, we've been able to include that measure, an actual outcome measure. They also include debt repayment numbers. Well, this year, the department decided not to produce that data. So that was a positive that became a negative. What they did do is produce that data by program, as I was saying before, by major rather than institutionally. I don't know whether we can't have both, and we hope that we can.
Where should reporters be especially skeptical about using some of the limited data that's tied to things like a college report card?
The report card is based on a number of databases, and it can tell you some things and not other things. One thing that's frustrating is it doesn't show how Black and Hispanic students perform relative to white students. So there's all kinds of inequities that we see in the general numbers that we can't go down to the institution level or the program level to see performance of. And so we have to do these workarounds, which is what we did in the case of that ranking of schools that do well on majors popular with Blacks. But they're workarounds. They don't give you the fine-grained information you need. The numbers aren't very good at telling you which schools students transfer to other schools and then get their degrees, or are getting school transfer students. That is very common, especially among adult and lower income students, but the data doesn't capture that very well. We don't have good data. Most of the data is based on what they call first-time, full-time students, meaning part-time students. The data, does not reflect very well their experiences. All of that can be fixed if we would have a system whereby the federal government, instead of using these different data sets and putting them together, just had the data on student outcomes from the individual schools with the individuals' names obviously taken out. Then we can have nice things. Until then, we can't.
I'm curious, in terms of the pandemic, how do you think it's changing how students and families think about college?
Well, I have a son who was a resident at a college on the other side of the country, and he's home, and he didn't like it one little bit. And I think he and I are both aware that we are paying the same price for him studying on a computer in Bethesda, Maryland, as we were when he was in class at this school. And so I think that has to have an effect on the sense people have of whether they're getting value for their money. And as we know, as college has increased in out-of-pocket tuition cost and people have had to take on more debt, it undermines the value proposition that's there. College is great, but it depends on how much you pay for it. The other thing that I suspect is going to happen is students are going to recognize, as they do already, that opening schools for in-class studies, which then lead to students and professors and cafeteria workers getting the virus and then shutting down, was a really poor choice. And I think that's going to sour their views on their particular schools. And I think they're going to wind up demanding change. What do students do when they get angry? They take it out on their schools. Anything in society that happens, they take it out on their schools. So I expect that what we're going to see when students go back is a wave of protest.
I think that's an interesting conclusion. And I think, one thing we've been encouraging journalists to focus on is students who are choosing to delay their enrollment, freshmen, and instead take some of their prerequisites at community colleges since they know they're going to be sticking close to home. And I'm curious, do you think there'll be a return back to focusing on community colleges in future rankings?
Yes, we have in the past ranked community colleges several times. The Aspen Institute also does a very good ranking. Because they do that, we tend to say, well, we'll save our bullets for other things. For instance, we rank best colleges for adults some years. It's vitally important. My son went to a community college, and like every sector of higher education, there's great diversity. There are phenomenal community colleges, and there are quite terrible ones. So it's absolutely worth doing.
I'm wondering also how the pandemic might change next year's rankings in terms of the formula and the methodology that the Washington Monthly plans to use.
That's a good question. Next year, we're still going to be working with data that's pre-COVID. The newest data that the government and other data sources put out are usually the previous years or the previous before that. And so in many cases, we add 3 years worth of data just so that we're not picking up noise. And so I'm not sure that we're going to have a big change next year. What's going to be a source of debate in the magazine is what to do about the fact that the federal government no longer is giving us institution level earnings and debt repayment data. Our upward mobility ranking may have to be the poorer for that.
As editor-in-chief, you get to steer the coverage for the magazine. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to steer some coverage on an even bigger scale, and that is, what's a story you wish higher education reporters across the country were covering now? What would you like to see them focus on?
I'd say two things. One, if I were an education reporter for a metropolitan daily or even a smaller community website, I would take and look at our rankings, but others, and draw a circle around where I'm at of about 200 miles, which is where 80% of students, choose schools that distance or closer, and just do a ranking based on our ranking of the best and worst schools in that area. I think that would be a useful exercise, useful information, and we would be happy to help with it. And I don't think it would be a ton of work. That's an easy one. On the more ambitious front, I would urge education reporters to just take stock of what a shambles the system is in right now. And this is hard, but when you're on a ship that's sinking, you have to be more aggressive than talking about what are the best ways to rearrange the deck chairs. We have a crisis in higher education. It has been years in the making. It is now much more acute. And we have to be rethinking higher education from the ground up. And I would hope reporters would be asking themselves, what would that look like? What would a better system look like? And how do we get there?
Paul Glastris is the editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly magazine, and he joined us from Bethesda, Maryland. Paul, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.